All right. Anyway, Canada was given to Britain. All the territory east of the Mississippi River was given to Britain, but the territory west of the Mississippi River was given to Spain because Spain had fought with the English. So the British who had won the war agreed to give the territory west of the Mississippi to Spain because of Spain's help. The French still had some territory in the West Indies, but not much. Now, there was the Treaty of Paris is still in force to this day, and that part of the treaty was that the people of Quebec, who were mostly French at that time, it was promised that they could still live in Quebec. They would not have to learn English. They could still speak French, and they would not have to become Protestants. So to this day, the people of Quebec still speak French, and they're still mostly Catholic. Even though they do have freedom to become Protestant if they want to, but they were never coerced into abandoning Catholicism. That treaty, that part of the treaty is still in force this day. Now in 1995, they had a vote, and Quebec voted to remain part of Canada. Quebec has never left Canada, even though a lot of the people in Quebec still speak French. All right. Yeah, Cuba was given back to Spain. Jamaica remained with Great Britain. Now, here, okay, when I was a child, I read 2 biographies of Paul Revere, and one thing that I learned about Paul Revere was he felt like the British treated him badly. Paul Revere joined the British Army during the French and Indian War. He got together a bunch of colonial militiamen, and when the British saw him, all the British Army just laughed out loud. The colonials could not march in step, were not disciplined, did not all look straight ahead. They'd look around, whatever. Basically, the British thought the colonials were just, were nothing. Again, like Daniel Boone thought he would be made a good scout. Instead, they made him nothing more than a mule truck driver, showing utter contempt for everything colonial. The British said, we, with our armies, we won the war, and gave almost no credit to the help the colonials had given them. The colonials were oftentimes given the task of carrying out the garbage or some of the most menial of tasks, and basically mistreated. A fort that the colonials took from the French was given back to the French during the Treaty of Paris, which really upset the colonials. We lost a lot of men taking that fort, but again, the diplomats, when they get together, they sometimes do things that, I'll give you this if you'll give me that, or I'll trade you this for that. That's diplomacy, and the colonials did not understand this. So, in fact, Paul Revere visited a British officer one time who just kept looking at the book and how he ignored him. Paul goes, why do we have to have our buttons all straight? Why do we have to have our shoes all shined? Why? And a British officer looked on like he was just contemptuous and wouldn't answer. Paul Revere went to his grave wondering why the British officer had that attitude toward him. Again, this was the British. The colonials were different. So the colonials were looked down on, and again, this did a lot to turn the colonials against the British. The colonials had gone to Havana and lost more than half their men, but at the end of the war, England was not appreciative. Another thing bad about the Treaty of Paris, and this was to be true of the later Treaty of Paris in 1783, the Indians were not represented. No Indian went to Paris, and the Indian views were completely discounted. The treaty was made without the Indians. Well, now here's the problem. England was deep, very deep into debt. About this time, the old King of England died. He is so old, George II, he outlived his son. So the throne went to his grandson, a young man named George III. Your book describes George III as young and insecure. As a young man, as a young boy, the word got around to all of that George III could not do his lessons. George III was not very smart. And it became a scandal. Everybody wondered, what kind of king will he be if he's not very smart as a youngster? Growing up, he could not learn math very well. He could not learn his geometry very well. He was very slow at learning to read. And again, folks, that did not necessarily mean he wasn't very smart. But nevertheless, he became insecure, as other boys could do better at almost everything that he could. But he was the one in line for the throne, so he got the throne. He tried to rule, he tried to govern. His mother would tell him, be a king. He was determined not to be a figurehead, but at the same time he was also did not want to have happen to him what had happened to Charles I. It had been less than 100 years before that Charles I had had his head chopped off. He didn't want that to happen to him either, so he was somewhat insecure, somewhat afraid. Things were going wrong also. The bunch of Indian tribes got together. Among the Indians, some prophets arose who said, you must go back to your old ways. Your problem is you've abandoned your great spirit. You're worshiping the white man's God. We must quit that. We must quit trading with the white man. And they got a lot of converts. The Indians rose up and they defeated a lot of forts, took a lot of forts. Again, the fighting was suicide. The Indians did not want to accept defeat in a war, but the British got together, sent out their armies, and they defeated the Indians again. To keep peace with the Indians, the British passed a law called the Proclamation Act, and it said, I'm not going to write it down, but there must not be settlements across this line. They said, this is a line, you Europeans settle here, leave this to the Indians. Now, folk, in the modern world, with our GPSs, with our helicopters, with our walkie-talkies, our instant communications, with our cell phones, a law like that could be enforced. In the 1760s, with none of the stuff I just named, it was impossible. What the people of England did not realize was the distances. All right, if you look at a map, England, small little country. Look at a map of the United States, a huge country, and the English just didn't realize how big the area was, and white settlers went to the west anyway. Now here is a problem, particularly this was true in New England. A man might have 8 sons. Well, if he divided his property among his 8 sons, and they each had 8 sons apiece, there would after a short while not be any property left for any one of them, hardly a foot to stand on. So what the men started doing, they started saying, well, I'm going to give all my property to my oldest son, and the rest of you, head before you can find property and get yourself some land. Well, where were they to go to get land? Well, to the west. So the white man went more and more to the west and took the land from the Indians. A bunch of Scotch-Irish, and I'm descended from Scotch-Irish, partly, got together and they massacred a bunch of Indians. Turned out, though, the Indians they massacred were friendly Indians, who did not need to be massacred. This is oftentimes what happens to vigilante groups. Vigilantes, people who take the law into their own hands. But the Indians were finally defeated, and they also learned that the French were no longer around to help them. Somehow they assumed the French had always been there, would be there again. But it didn't work this time. Well, England had a problem, though. How are we going to pay for this tremendous debt? So they said to the colonials, you're going to have to, we fought this war for you, you're going to have to help us pay for the debt. The colonials said, yeah, we're willing to pay, but, how do we pay? Well, we're going to impose taxes on you. Now, wait a minute. Now, folk, the law in England that said that taxes could only be raised through Parliament, that law had been on the books in England for some 600 or 700 years. The American Revolution was one of the few revolutions in history where they tried to get the government to obey laws that had been on the books already for hundreds of years. King Charles I needed money, and he tried to get money by dissolving the Parliament and imposing a tax without Parliament. And guess what? They chopped off his head. King George III knew better than that, but nevertheless, the colonials said, now wait a minute, where are our representatives in Parliament? There were none. The British said, well listen, let me explain to you, unlike in your country, in our country, every man in Parliament represents the whole empire and not just his own district. The Americans said, that's not acceptable. We believe that if we're going to pay tax, we should have representatives in Parliament also. So it created a conflict. Well, during the war, the British had passed a law that all nations pass in wartime, that there was to be allowed no trade with the enemy. In other words, nobody was allowed to trade with the French. Well, a colonial merchant ship would leave port saying we're heading for England, but once they got out to sea, they'd go to France. And an English vessel would happen to be in the area and catch them pulling in at France. Caught them red-handed. This was an act of treason, pure and simple, trading with the enemy. So, again, all this. And again, if you look at, well, who was right and who was wrong, again, as the case of most conflicts, both sides oftentimes are equally right. Now, this is not always the case. World War II, you can't accuse both sides of being equally wrong. World War I, yeah, both sides were equally wrong. Sometimes in the conflict, both sides, if just one side would solve the problem, there would be no conflict, but sometimes there's only one, it's one-sided. In the case of the Revolutionary War, the British had their point. The colonials were undisciplined, wild, free. The British passed a law that said that any British ship who sees a colonial ship has the right to pull up beside that ship and go and search that ship to see what it's selling. This upset the colonials greatly. Next coming up to the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act Stamp Act simply stated that every document that was important had to have a British stamp on it. Now, the documents had to have a stamp were marriage licenses, contracts, and wills, as title deeds. All these documents had to have a British stamp. Well, as soon as the colonials heard about it, they said, hey, this is dangerous because they are taxing us without our consent. The colonials got together and decided we're not going to pay it. Governor Hutchinson wrote the king a letter begging the king to take off this, because the Stamp Act was not to take effect for several months, but the King of England ignored it. Also, and I hear, folk, is what some people have said was the real cause of the revolution. These stamps were to be paid for in gold and silver coins and not in paper money. Now, why is this important? From the beginning of its history, when the colonies had very little gold and silver coins, colonials began trading in paper money. Banks would issue banknotes that colonials used to trade. Governments would put out paper that they would use as money. Or rich people would write IOUs, I'll pay you this, IOUs. Paper began to be used as money from the beginning, and it made the colonials wealthier than they otherwise would have been. The colonials had very little gold and silver coins. The British wanted the colonials to stop using their paper money and to use only gold and silver, and this would have thrown the colonials into deep poverty. It got worse later when the British started sending their governors over here again. They insisted the governors be paid in gold and silver coins, which the colonials simply didn't have. And again, some people believe this was really what caused the war. Now, there are other things, though. Imagine if, supposing a problem developed in the colonies, maybe there was an Indian attack or an uprising, they'd write a letter to the king saying, Your Majesty, we're being attacked by Indians. It would take 4 months for the letter to get there and 4 months for the king to make a reply. Now, what kind of government is that? 8 months from the time you have a problem to the time you receive a reply, what the king wants to do. 4 months one way, 4 months back. Again, this created problems also. As for the Stamp Act, the colonials decided they weren't going to obey it. A bunch of stamp collectors their effigies built on them, and they had their heads cut off in effigy, not in reality, but in effigy. In the case of Thomas Hutchinson, he had his house torn down except for a few walls were left standing. And another man, tax collector, was burned in effigy. One tax collector had a hole dug for him, and he realized, oops, so he quickly recanted and decided he wasn't going to collect the tax. To make a long story short, the stamp tax was never collected. The colonials simply refused to pay. When the Parliament saw that the tax wouldn't work, they paid it. The Parliament rescinded the law. Patrick Henry spoke up and said that, hey, we're not going to obey it. He got 5 resolutions up that said that Virginia will not issue the stamps. Other colonials followed suit. No one would dare enforce it, so the law had to be repealed. Well, the British government didn't give up. They passed the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts imposed taxes on colonial imports. It was an indirect tax because the colonials would not pay the tax, rather the tax would be paid by the merchant, by the importer. So it looked like, it would be like, when you buy gasoline, that's the one commodity thing you can buy where the tax is included in the price of the gas. So you go to the gas pump and pump gas, you may or may not realize you're paying a tax. How much? I'll be honest, I don't even know. Any of you know how much of the gas you buy is taxed? Not a one of you know, I don't either. But it's a hidden tax. Now, on the other hand, if you go buy a tire for your car, you might pay $100 for the tire and $7 taxes. $107 if your tax is 7%. You know how much is tax. That's an open tax. But basically, they had this hidden tax for the imports that they didn't call it a tax. It's just the merchant paid it. But you believed that you were paying for the product and not paying any taxes. Well, the colonists caught on to this real quickly, and they refused to buy colonial goods. Now, there was something else. Because the British were sending troops over here to fight the Indians, supposedly, rather than build barracks for their troops, the British government said to colonials, you are to house your troops in our homes. So if you'd lived in your colonies at the time, you get a knock on your door, and there'd be maybe about 20 troops sitting out the door. The British officer would knock on your door and say, you need to take 2 of these men into your home. Paul and Jack, you come here. And you'd have no choice but put them into your home, whether you wanted to or not. Quartering of troops. Now, one of the 10 Bills of Rights says that our government will never ask private citizens to quarter troops in their homes in peacetime without the consent of the owner. But British were forced to, the British forced colonials to keep troops whether the owner consented or not. Well, the New York Assembly passed a resolution that we're not going to quarter British troops in our private houses. The British government heard about it 4 months later, and they declared the act of the Assembly null and void. Colonials began to fear that, hey, if the British can declare our colonial assembly laws null and void, after a while our assemblies won't have any power at all. The Massachusetts Assembly met, and Samuel Adams stood up and said, Parliament has no right to tax the colonies because we colonials are not represented in Parliament. Well, colonials began boycotting British goods. Women would not buy British products. The colonials began to manufacture stuff themselves. And in the case of Paul Revere, he had learned that all the bells that used in churches were made in Great Britain, so he thought he'd make a bell himself. So Paul Revere put a bell together, and it made a very flat sound. So he got to wondering, how in the world can I make a bell that rings? So he went to all the churches he could get to and measured the dimensions of the bell, every dimension he could measure, how thick they were, and finally cast a bell that had a good ring to it. It was not just a matter of putting a shape, but it was how thick the bell should be, how long it should be, and how much it should curve, all this figured in. But he finally got a bell that would ring. He began making bells in our country, so we would not be buying bells from Britain. British merchants began to feel the punch. They lost all this trade with the colonials. Now, in the meantime, the crowds began to protest. An 11-year-old boy was killed by some British soldiers. A lot of colonials began to demonstrate. The colonials once got together and they started throwing sticks and rocks at British soldiers. In retaliation, some British soldiers leveled their rifles and fired. 5 colonials were killed. This is called the Boston Massacre. Now, a lot of persons became really upset at the British, but John Adams said that everybody has a right to be heard and has a right to a fair trial, so he volunteered to represent the soldiers who were accused, and the judge agreed to have a fair hearing. It was decided that most of the British soldiers acted in self-defense, and therefore they had a right to shoot back, that they ran a risk of being seriously hurt by people throwing rocks and sticks at them. Now, folk, in today's world, I don't think this would happen. I mean, if you had a case where a bunch of citizens were throwing rocks and sticks at cops, and the cops shot at them, I think that the cops would be held liable. But in those days, the soldiers who fired got off free, acquitted on grounds that they were acting in self-defense. There were 2 exceptions. 2 soldiers had one of their fingers branded because they were found guilty of acting excessively, but other than that, the rest of them were turned loose. And again, it showed the British that their people could receive a fair trial here in this country. Again, the morals of that time and the laws of that time were different. It reminded me of something happened in Japan recently. A baseball manager got mad at one of his baseball players on the team and socked the player. The player took the manager to court. The judges ruled in favor of the manager, that the manager had been provoked, and the judge, therefore the manager had a right to sock the player. That could hardly happen here in the United States. Now, in the United States, a manager socks a player and he gets fined, jailed, fired, or whatever. But anyway, they have a different law over there. Tea Party. The British finally repealed all taxes except for one small tax on tea to try to show they had a right to tax the colonies. The British ships came over with a bunch of tea. None of the tea was unloaded. Up and down the coast they had a tea party. In a case of, in Maryland, your book doesn't mention this, but they burned the British ships that carried the tea. But the most famous tea party of all of them was the Boston Tea Party. What happened was some men dressed up as Mohawk Indians. They covered their faces with some kind of makeup that could make them unrecognizable. And they went and boarded the British ships that had the tea, and they dumped all the tea into the British harbor. All right. Well, this created a lot of tensions with the British also. The British got a new prime minister named Lord North. He wanted to have peace with the colonies, so he repealed all taxes that Parliament imposed. But this calmed things down for a few years. But then there was another incident, and again, folks, sometimes in some of this the British were right. A British warship was chasing a suspected smuggler. The smuggler fired against the British warship and basically burned the British warship, sunk it in the mid-ocean. The British government said that whoever was the suspect of the incident was going to be sent to England for trial and tried for treason. And the trial for treason in those days always carried the death penalty. Well, here is the problem, folk. The British had every right to protect its navy, to protect its seamen. But here is an issue, and this is in our Constitution. The colonials said that the law said that they should not take a person far away to be tried far away, that whoever was caught smuggling was supposed to be tried right here in the colonies with a jury made up of colonials, and this jury would determine guilt or innocence. The British knew that a colonial jury might acquit the colonials, so the British said, no, we're going to bring this person, whoever we catch, to England, and we're going to try them for treason in England, for attacking an English warship and burning it and sinking it in the ocean and killing the crew. We're going to try them for treason in England. Again, this was contrary to the law that had been on the books for several hundred years. The colonials were very, very upset. Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee got together and formed what they called committees of correspondence. The committees of correspondence were to inform each other of every infraction of British law that they knew of. Well, the committees of correspondence, again, they kept each other informed by means of horsemen on fast horses who would go around from colony to colony telling each other what had happened in that colony. Also, there were the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty went around harassing British government officials, British governors, forcing a lot of them to resign. Well, anyway, after the Boston Tea Party, the British government passed a series of laws called the Intolerable Acts. They have two names. They're sometimes called the Coercive Acts or Intolerable. Because when the colonists heard them, they said, hey, these acts, they're intolerable. Now, of the Intolerable Acts, one of them was that the port of Boston was to be closed until the tea was paid for. You can understand why. Local government was to be restricted. In other words, the British said, we're going to take over because you can't run yourselves. We're going to be your government and you won't have your own government. The councils were people appointed by the English king and not elected by the officials. If a royal official was accused, he was to be tried in England and not tried in the colonies. Again, even though the British soldiers who had fired on colonials at Boston received a fair trial, nevertheless, they said, you colonials will not give us a fair trial. Quebec was to be given to Canada was to be given all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. In other words, the 13 colonies were not to have any of this land from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. All this land was to be given to Quebec. And that military commanders could quarter troops in private households. These, when the colonials read it, the colonials said, these are intolerable. Now, there was another act that I've got to mention. That here's where I'll side with the British. The British said that Catholics are to be given the right to vote and hold office in the colonies. Again, a lot of colonials were denying the Catholics this right. But again, all this did was upset the colonials even further. So as a result, the colonials met in what was called the First Continental Congress. It was an unofficial Congress, had no real legal authority, but they met to try to resolve the problems between the United States and Great Britain. Now, in the meantime,